The radio crackled once, then died in Grant Holloway's hand before he hurled it into the dry ditch. It landed in a puff of gray dust, wheels up, useless. He laughed, not a big laugh, a short one, the kind a man gives when he already knows he's won. Across the cracked earth, Otis Merrow stood with one hand resting on Duke's shoulder. The bull's ribs rose and fell, slow and deliberate, but his eyes stayed fixed on the concrete wall rising where the creek used to run. Duke lowered his head and pushed it against an empty trough. The metal rang out, hollow, and he pushed again, harder, a low rumble building in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Something ancient in the animal understood exactly what a dry trough meant in the middle of a cordwind summer, and it did not accept the answer quietly. Grant Holloway watched the bull from the top of the newly assembled weir. Heavy concrete slabs and steel gates, already choking the lifeline that had fed 6 farms for 3 generations. He wore boots that had never touched a plow. His smile had the shine of a man who signs contracts, not one who digs post holes. "You could use those boots of yours, old man," he called down. "Dig yourself a well, or sign the papers, and I'll have someone run a fire hose out to your barn by Friday." Otis said nothing. He didn't look up at Grant. He looked at the dam, at the water pooling uselessly on the far side of it, at the cracked mud where a creek used to run free for people who'd never once asked his permission to drink from it. Then he turned and he walked Duke back toward the barn without a single word. What Grant Holloway didn't know, what his lawyers hadn't bothered to check, what his engineers hadn't thought to ask, was that underneath that dry, defeated-looking farm sat something older and more powerful than every dollar in his corporate account. Something established in 1938, sealed by a perpetual county charter, and about to remind an entire county exactly who the land really answers to. Before we get to the part where a rich man's smile disappears for good, I need you to do something small for me. If you've ever watched someone quiet get pushed too far and win, hit that subscribe button right now. Not for me. For every stubborn old farmer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. There are more stories like this one coming, and I don't want you to miss the moment the tables turn. 3 days before the dam went up, Grant Holloway had walked onto Otis Merrow's porch wearing a suit that cost more than most of the county's trucks combined. He'd smiled the way men like him always smiled, like the outcome was already decided, and this conversation was just a formality he was generous enough to offer. $800,000, he'd said, sliding a folder across the porch railing. Cash, signed by Friday, and you never have to worry about drought, taxes, or fence repairs again. Otis hadn't opened the folder. He'd looked past Grant, out toward the field where his father and grandfather had both worked themselves into the ground for a piece of dirt that owed them nothing and gave them everything anyway. Duke had been standing in the near pasture that day, too, watching the stranger with the same steady suspicion he was showing now. "This land isn't for sale," Otis had said. 6 words, no raised voice, no negotiation left open at the edges, just a door closing, quiet and final. Grant hadn't liked that answer. Men who are used to getting what they want rarely do. He'd left the folder on the railing, and by the time his car had pulled out of the driveway, he'd already made a phone call that would change everything. What Otis didn't know, not yet, was that Holloway Reach had spent that same week quietly acquiring controlling shares in the Brackenfield County Water Authority. It hadn't been difficult. The county pump station had been underfunded for years, its board desperate for the kind of capital only a corporation like Holloway Reach could offer. Grant had bought his way into the one piece of infrastructure that controlled water rights for 6 farms along Muleshoe Draw, and he hadn't spent a single dollar breaking any law to do it. That was the part that made it dangerous. Grant Holloway hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't trespassed. He'd simply purchased the tap, and now he controlled the flow. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who didn't meet Otis's eyes when he handed it over. Official Brackenfield County Water Authority letterhead. Buried in 3 paragraphs of legal language was a single operational notice. Surface water delivery to the Marrow property would be suspended, effective immediately, pending infrastructure realignment. Otis had read it once at the kitchen table, his coffee going cold beside him. Then he'd folded it in half, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and gone out to check on the herd like it was any other morning. By that afternoon, the heavy flatbeds and crane trucks had arrived at the mouth of the creek. Grant Holloway had come with them, standing at the edge of the construction site in boots so clean they still had the store's finish on the soles. He hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to watch. The Holloway weir went up in less than 6 hours, a modular barrier of interlocking precast concrete blocks anchored with hydraulic steel sluice gates, engineered to drop in fast and choke off a waterway 6 farms had shared without conflict for over 80 years. Grant stood at the top of the embankment as the last crane pulled away, looking down at the trickle of water trapped behind his new obstruction and out at the cracked, thirsty stretch of muleshoe draw beyond it. That was when Otis had walked down with Duke, expecting nothing, hoping for less. And that was when Grant had thrown his radio into the ditch and offered him a fire hose in exchange for 80 years of family history. "You've got until Friday," Grant called out, straightening his jacket like the conversation was already finished. "After that, I imagine your cattle are going to have a very difficult August." Otis looked at the dam. He looked at Duke, whose flanks were tired from days of rationed water hauled in plastic tanks from town, barely enough to keep a prize herd alive and nowhere near enough to sustain 80 acres of pasture. And then, for the second time in 3 days, Otis Marrow said nothing at all. He simply turned, put a steady hand on Duke's neck, and walked back toward the barn, toward a piece of machinery Grant Holloway had never once bothered to notice, sitting quiet and patient behind the old workshop doors, waiting for a job it was built to do over 70 years ago. The workshop hadn't been touched by anyone but Otis in almost a decade. It sat behind the barn, a low building of gray wood and rusted tin, easy to overlook if you didn't know what it held. Grant Holloway had walked right past it 3 days earlier without a second glance. To a man like him, an old shed was just an old shed. He had no reason to imagine that anything inside it could matter more than $800,000. Otis pushed the door open and the smell hit him the way it always did, oil, dust, and something like memory. Duke waited outside, tethered loosely to the fence post, his dark eyes following every movement through the open doorway. He wasn't calm exactly. He was watching. The way an animal watches a man he trusts when that man is about to do something important. In the center of the workshop, beneath a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat a machine that time had mostly forgotten, a Witte diesel engine built in 1952, single-cylinder, cast iron, heavy enough that it had taken 4 men to move it into place the year Otis's father installed it. It had no digital panel, no sensors, no wireless connection to anyone's phone. It was, by every modern measure, obsolete. Grant had called it a piece of garbage once, walking the property line during an earlier visit, barely glancing at it before turning back to his phone. Otis hadn't corrected him. There are men you don't waste words on, and Grant Holloway had proven himself to be one of them within the first 30 seconds of their first conversation. Otis pulled the tarp away slow, folding it with the kind of care most people reserve for something breakable. He ran a rag over the flywheel, over the cast housing, over the brass fittings that had gone dull with years of disuse but not 1 hour of neglect. Every part of this machine had a story attached to it, and every story belonged to someone who had come before him. His grandfather had drilled the well in 1938, back when land in this county was still being measured in hope rather than dollars. 200 feet down, past layers of rock most men wouldn't have had the patience to break through, he'd struck something extraordinary, an ancient aquifer, untouched, holding water older than the farms sitting above it. While the surface streams of muleshoe draw came and went with the seasons, rising after spring rains and shrinking under summer heat, that deep reservoir remained constant, steady, indifferent to drought, indifferent to men who thought they could starve a valley by blocking a creek that ran across the top of the ground. Otis's grandfather hadn't just drilled a well. He'd understood something Grant Holloway never would, that real power in this land didn't sit on the surface where everyone could see it and fight over it. Real power sat quiet, 200 feet down, waiting for someone patient enough to reach it. Otis worked the crank slowly at first, feeling for the old rhythm in his shoulders, the muscle memory his body hadn't used in years, but hadn't forgotten either. Duke shifted at the fence post, ears forward, watching the old man labor with the same intensity he'd shown at the empty trough that morning. The engine resisted. It always did, the first pull of any season, iron and grease remembering their own kind of stubbornness. Otis didn't rush it. He wasn't a man who rushed anything. He set his boots, gripped the crank with both weathered hands, and threw his whole body into a single committed pull. Nothing happened for one long, silent second. Then, deep in the cast-iron chest of a machine built 2 years after the end of a war, something caught. The Witte engine roared to life with a sound that hadn't echoed across this property in years. Thump, 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 thump. A heartbeat, mechanical and enormous, rolling out across the dry silence of Ash Creek land like something waking up after a very long sleep. Smoke curled from the exhaust stack, black and thick for a moment before settling into a steady gray rhythm that matched the pulse of the pistons underneath it. Duke's head came up sharp. His ears swiveled toward the sound. For a moment he simply stood there, still and alert, as if trying to understand what his body already seemed to know, that something had shifted, that the silence of the last 3 days had broken, that hope had a sound, and it sounded exactly like this. Otis stood back from the engine, hands on his hips, watching it settle into its work. Water began moving through pipes that hadn't carried anything in years, pulled up from 200 feet below the cracked, thirsty ground Grant Holloway thought he'd already won. The old man allowed himself the smallest thing that could be called a smile. "Let's see him try to buy this," he said quietly, to no one but the bull and the machine. The water reached the trough 11 minutes after the engine caught its rhythm. Otis heard it before he saw it, a low gurgle rising through old iron pipe, then a rush, then the unmistakable slap of water hitting the bottom of an empty steel basin. Duke was there before Otis was, straining against the loose tether, nostrils flared, front hooves shifting in the dust with an urgency that needed no translation. Otis untied him and stepped back. Duke didn't drink right away. He lowered his massive head toward the trough and simply stood there for a moment, as if he needed to confirm with his own senses that this was real, that the water wasn't some cruel trick of memory. Then he drank. Long, deep pulls, water splashing over his muzzle and down into the dust below, disappearing into ground that had been thirsty for 3 days. Otis stood with one hand resting against the old bull's shoulder, saying nothing, watching the animal do the only thing either of them had wanted since Grant Holloway threw his radio into a dry ditch and laughed. The Witte engine kept its rhythm behind them. Thump, 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 thump. Steady as a man who has already decided he isn't going anywhere. What Otis Merrow didn't know, and had no way of knowing yet, was that 11 miles away, inside the gleaming glass headquarters of Holloway Reach, a very different kind of alarm had just started sounding. Desmond Frey had been an engineer for the company for exactly 14 months. He was young enough to still believe that systems behaved the way they were designed to behave, and green enough that when the first pressure warning flashed across his monitor, he assumed it was a sensor malfunction. He restarted the diagnostic. The warning flashed again, this time accompanied by a second one, and then a third. He pulled up the live feed from the automated irrigation network Holloway Reach had spent nearly $4 million installing across its newly acquired land, a system of smart sprinkler heads, underground sensors, and pressure-regulated valves designed to distribute water with mathematical precision across thousands of acres. It was, according to every promotional brochure the company had ever printed, the most advanced agricultural water system in the state of Cordwin. It was also, Desmond realized with a tightening in his chest, losing pressure at a rate that made no sense. He checked the reservoir levels first. Full, as expected, since the Holloway Weir was holding back nearly the entire surface flow of Muleshoe Draw. That wasn't the problem. He checked the delivery lines next, tracing the pressure drop backward through the system, watching numbers fall in real time across zones that should have been stable. It took him almost 20 minutes to understand what he was looking at, and when he finally did, his hands went still on the keyboard. The modular dam hadn't just blocked surface water, it had backed up thousands of tons of hydrostatic head pressure into the subsoil behind it. The entire regional water table had become an overpressurized hydraulic chamber, and the moment an unmapped deep well puncture opened up downstream, that trapped subsurface pressure equalized with violent force, creating a massive reverse siphon that dragged dense silt, sand, and sediment backward into Holloway Reach's low-pressure filtration grid, blinding sensors and clogging high-tolerance smart valves across every zone. Desmond ran the numbers twice before he trusted them. Then he grabbed his tablet and left his desk at a pace just short of a run. He found Grant Holloway in the executive conference room, mid-sentence in a call with an investor, looking exactly as pleased with himself as he had standing atop his new dam 3 days earlier. "We have a problem," Desmond said, cutting through a wall of glass and confidence that clearly wasn't used to being interrupted. Grant covered the receiver with his palm. "This better be good. The irrigation network is losing pressure across every zone south of the weir. We're pulling sediment into the smart valve system. If it keeps going, we're going to lose the sprinkler heads entirely, all of them, across 4,000 acres. For a moment, something flickered behind Grant's eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly. Not yet. More like the first crack in a foundation a man has never bothered to inspect, because he never imagined he'd need to. "That's impossible," Grant said. "We built that system to industry spec." "The spec didn't account for trapping that much subsurface head pressure against an unmapped artesian fault," Desmond said. "Sir, this isn't a mechanical glitch. It's hydrostatic physics." Grant ended his call without excusing himself. He walked to the window of his office, looking out over acres of land his company had never actually earned, only purchased, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Brackenfield County, he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has built something enormous on ground he never bothered to understand. Behind him, Desmond pulled up the topographical survey, tracing the boundary of Holloway Reach's new territory against an older, smaller parcel, marked simply as Marrow Farm, a stubborn little rectangle of land sitting square in the middle of everything Grant had just spent a fortune to control. "There's something else," Desmond said quietly. "An ancient deep well on the Marrow property just went online at 200 feet. It breached the pressurized aquifer. That pressure release acted like a vacuum trigger, and our entire $4 million distribution line is taking the hit." Grant turned from the window slowly. "The old man," he said, more to himself than to Desmond, "the old man did this." Somewhere behind him a phone was already ringing, the first of what would become a very long, very expensive afternoon. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the phone in Grant Holloway's office hadn't stopped ringing. The first call came from the field crew supervisor, reporting that 6 sprinkler heads in Zone 12 had failed entirely, clogged with sediment the filtration system had never been designed to handle. The second call came from the irrigation contractor Holloway Reach had paid nearly $4 million, informing Grant that the damage wasn't isolated, it was spreading zone by zone as pressure continued equalizing beneath a water table nobody at the company had ever properly mapped. The third call came from the county. Grant answered that one himself. "Mr. Holloway," said a voice he didn't recognize, calm in the particular way government officials are trained to sound calm right before they ruin your week. "This is the Brackenfield County Environmental Compliance Office. We've received a report of significant hydrological disturbance originating from your property. I need to ask you some questions about the construction of your dam." Grant hung up 11 minutes later, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his hand wasn't entirely steady when he set the phone back down. Desmond stood in the doorway, tablet still in hand, watching his employer with the particular caution of a young man who has just realized his boss might not actually have a plan. "Sir, if the county opens a federal referral on this, we're not looking at a fine. We're looking at criminal liability for damage to a shared aquifer system. That's not a civil matter anymore." "I know what it is," Grant snapped, though the sharpness in his voice sounded thinner than it had 3 days ago. He walked to the window again. Below, across 4,000 acres of land he'd spent a fortune converting into the most sophisticated irrigation system in the state of Cordwin, a slow, silent failure was spreading through pipes and valves he could no longer see or control. Every dollar he'd invested in modern efficiency was being undone by pressure differentials he hadn't known existed a week ago, caused by an old man and a machine Grant had dismissed as garbage without a second look. "Get the well records," Grant said finally. "Every water right on that property. I want to know what that old man thinks he's standing on." It took the legal team less than 2 hours to find it, and considerably longer to explain it to Grant in language simple enough for him to understand. While Grant Holloway's lawyers were still combing through county archives, a very different kind of visitor was arriving at Holloway Reach's front lobby. Otis Marrow walked in wearing the same clothes he'd worn to check on his herd that morning, no suit, no appointment, no assistant clearing his path. He carried a single manila envelope, its edges softened and browned with age, tucked beneath one arm like something far more valuable than paper had any right to be. The receptionist asked if he had a meeting scheduled. Otis said no, but that Mr. Holloway would want to see him anyway. Something in the old man's voice, quiet, unhurried, entirely without doubt, was enough to send her scrambling for a phone. Grant came down to the lobby himself, jaw tight, still holding the fragments of a very bad afternoon. He hadn't expected Otis to come to him. Part of him, the part still clinging to the confidence that had carried him through every negotiation of his career, assumed the old farmer had finally come to accept the offer on the table, to trade 80 years of stubbornness for a number large enough to make the whole mess disappear. "Change your mind?" Grant asked, and there was still an edge of his old arrogance in it, though it sat uneasy now, like a coat that no longer fit quite right. Otis studied him for a long moment, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the same steady patience he'd shown Duke at the empty trough 3 days earlier. "No," Otis said. "I came to show you something you should have looked at before you poured that concrete." He held out the envelope. Grant didn't take it right away. Something in the weight of the old man's stillness made him hesitate, the way a man hesitates before opening a door he already suspects leads somewhere he doesn't want to go. Behind him, Desmond had appeared at the edge of the lobby, tablet still clutched against his chest, watching the exchange with the wide, careful eyes of someone who could already sense the shape of what was coming. "What is it?" Grant said. It wasn't really a question anymore. "Something my grandfather registered a long time before either one of us was born," Otis said. "You've got smart men and expensive lawyers looking through county records right now, trying to figure out what gives me the right to pull water out of my own ground, save them the trouble." He pressed the envelope into Grant's hands. For a moment, Grant Holloway simply stood there in his own lobby, holding a piece of paper that weighed almost nothing and was about to cost him everything he thought he'd already won. Grant opened the envelope in the lobby in front of his own staff, in front of the young engineer who already suspected what it contained. His fingers weren't as steady as he wanted them to be. Inside was a single document, its paper gone soft and amber with age, the ink faded but the seal at the bottom still legible. Grant unfolded it slowly. His eyes moved across the header first, County Archive stamp, a filing date from 1938, and something in his jaw tightened before he'd even read a single word of the text itself. The Muleshoe Deep Well Water Charter. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving the second time through. They didn't. The charter granted the Merrow family, by name, by bloodline, in language a 1938 county clerk had written in the same careful hand used to record births and land deeds, absolute priority rights to any subsurface aquifer beneath the property, along with an explicit prohibition against any surface construction that could alter the hydrostatic pressure of the regional water table. Grant's smile, the one that had been cracking slowly since Desmond first walked into his conference room, finally disappeared completely. He flipped to the next page, then flipped back to the first as though rereading it might somehow change what it said. "This is impossible," Grant said, though his voice had lost the certainty that phrase usually carried when he said it. "This is a piece of paper from 100 years ago." 88, Otis said, "and it's still binding. Might want to ask your lawyers about something called a perpetual water easement before you say another word about it being impossible." Desmond had already crossed the lobby, phone in hand, calling the legal department directly instead of waiting for Grant to give the order. Within 20 minutes, 3 attorneys had gathered in the same lobby, passing the document between them with the particular grimness of professionals watching a very expensive mistake take shape in real time. The senior counsel, a woman named Priya Ostrander, who had spent 11 years defending Holloway Reach's land acquisitions without ever losing a case, read the charter twice before she looked up at Grant. "It's valid," she said simply, "filed correctly, witnessed correctly, and never superseded by any subsequent water rights legislation in the state of Cordwin. If anything, this predates every modern water authority regulation we've been operating under. The dam didn't just cut off a shared surface creek. It violated an 88-year-old legal protection on subsurface pressure specifically written to prevent exactly what happened this afternoon." "So fix it," Grant said. "Pay him off, whatever it takes." "You don't understand," Priya said, and something in her tone made the lobby go very quiet. "This isn't a civil negotiation anymore, Grant. The county compliance office already has an emergency inspection warrant drafted for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, co-signed by federal environmental regulators. Combine that with a documented breach of a perpetual water charter, and the state attorney general will file felony charges for willful destruction of protected aquifer infrastructure. If that dam is still standing when the state investigators arrive at sunrise, you aren't looking at a fine, you're looking at a prison sentence." Grant looked down at the document again, at the faded ink of a promise made 88 years before he was born, by people who had understood something about this land that no modern engineer, no smart irrigation system, and no amount of money had ever managed to override. He looked up at Otis. The old farmer hadn't moved. He stood in the middle of a marble lobby that cost more to build than most homes in Brackenfield County, wearing work boots and a jacket with a torn pocket seam, and he looked entirely, calmly certain, the way a man looks when he has already won and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to that fact. "Friday," Otis said quietly, echoing the deadline Grant had given him 3 days earlier. "You said I had until Friday. Funny how fast things change." Grant's throat worked once before he spoke. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything from you," Otis said. "I want that dam gone, and I want the water flowing the way it's flowed for 80 years before you decided you owned it. After that, you and I don't have any more business together." For a long moment Grant Holloway said nothing at all, the man who 3 days earlier had thrown a radio into a dry ditch and laughed, who had stood on top of a concrete wall and offered an old farmer a fire hose in exchange for his family's land, now stood in his own lobby holding proof that every ounce of power he thought he had was built on ground he'd never once bothered to understand. He turned to his legal team. His voice, when it finally came, had none of the swagger it carried 3 days before. "Call the industrial crane contractor," Grant said, his face pale. "Rip those modular blocks out tonight, every single slab, before the federal inspectors show up at sunrise and find the evidence." The heavy crane crew arrived at Ash Creek Land before sunrise, their floodlights cutting through the gray mist along the same dirt road Grant Holloway had driven in his gleaming car 6 days before. There was no ceremony to it, no press release, no announcement scheduled for social media. Grant had insisted on that much, a desperate midnight extraction to pull the hydraulic gates and hoist the massive precast barrier blocks onto flatbeds before state officials arrived. Otis stood at the fence line with Duke beside him, watching as industrial cables hooked onto the modular concrete slabs, hauling away the obstruction that had choked Muleshoe Draw for less than a week. It was strange, he thought, how quickly something enormous could be undone once the right piece of paper found its way into the right hands. 88 years of patience sitting quiet in a drawer had taken less than a single morning to dismantle an operation that had cost Holloway Reach millions of dollars. By mid-afternoon, the last steel sluice had been loaded onto a flatbed, and Muleshoe Draw began doing what it had done for generations before Grant Holloway ever set foot in Cordwin, running free, unclaimed, indifferent to ownership disputes and boardroom decisions. The water moved slow at first, finding its old path through cracked earth, then faster, until the sound of it was almost loud enough to drown out the memory of the silence that had come before. Duke walked to the creek's edge without waiting to be led. He lowered his massive head and drank from moving water for the first time in 6 days, and something about the sight of it, an animal simply being allowed to do what nature had always intended, settled something in Otis's chest that no amount of legal victory ever could have reached on its own. The following week, the Brackenfield County Water Authority issued a formal notice suspending Holloway Reach's management rights over the central pump station, citing the documented hydrological violation and the unresolved compliance investigation still pending federal review. Control of the shared water infrastructure was transferred on an emergency basis to a newly formed cooperative made up of the 6 farms along Muleshoe Draw. Otis Marrow's name listed first among them, not because he'd asked for the honor, but because nobody else in the county had thought to argue against it. Grant Holloway didn't attend the transfer meeting. He sent a representative instead, a junior associate who looked deeply uncomfortable reading a prepared statement about respecting historical water rights and community partnership, phrases that rang hollow to everyone in the room who'd watched Grant throw a radio into a dry ditch and laugh less than 2 weeks earlier. Within a month, quiet reports began circulating that Holloway Reach's board had opened an internal review into the acquisitions division that had authorized the original dam construction. Grant's name came up in that review more than once. It was, by every account that reached Brackenfield County afterward, the beginning of the end of his career at the company that carried his name. Otis never spoke publicly about any of it. When a local paper asked for a comment, he gave them exactly one sentence: that the land had always known how to protect itself, and it had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to remind everyone else of that fact. Most afternoons now, if you drove far enough down the dirt road past what used to be Holloway Weir, you'd find Otis sitting on an overturned bucket outside his workshop, a tin cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching Duke drink from a trough that never ran empty again. Behind him, half visible through the open workshop doors, the old Witte diesel engine kept its rhythm, thump, 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 steady and unbothered, the way it had been built to run nearly 70 years before anyone thought a piece of paper and a stubborn old man could bring an entire corporation to its knees. It never made the news outside the county. There was no lawsuit with a headline-grabbing settlement, no viral moment, no dramatic courtroom scene. Just an old machine that never stopped working, an old document that never stopped mattering, and an old man who understood something most people spend their whole lives chasing without ever quite catching. That real power doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to be patient enough to wait for the right moment, and honest enough to be standing on solid ground when that moment finally arrives. If this story reminded you that quiet people are often the strongest people in the room, do one thing before you go. Subscribe and stay close. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's another stubborn old farmer standing his ground against someone who's about to learn the same lesson Grant Holloway did, the hard way and far too late.